Daily Broward is here with Roger Stone. He's a best-selling author, famous political consultant. He's worked for presidential campaigns for Bob Dole, Ronald Reagan, most famously Richard Nixon, which is the subject of his latest book, which is NIXON'S Secrets, The Rise, Fall, and Untold Truth of the President, Watergate, and the Pardon. It's from Skyhorse Publishing. It's available now on Amazon and at your local bookstore. Welcome, Roger Stone.
It's great to be here. I'm delighted to be with Daily Broward.
We were talking earlier that a lot of pop culture and myth has been surrounding Nixon's presidency. Subject of jokes, famous movies, books. Tell us if that factored into the book, if you thought that you could get more of the real story out of it.
Well, I mean, Richard Nixon is an epically fascinating figure. He is a man not comfortable in his own skin. He is an introvert in an extrovert's business. He has this amazing resilience, this persistence to follow his dream of being president. I think history just treats him in the epic election with John F. Kennedy because Theodore White, who was a very prominent writer at the time, wrote a book called The Making of the President in 1960, which completely changed the face of political journalism in terms of how we covered presidential elections from that point on. It was an idealized, romantic fairy tale in which John Kennedy is a dashing, charming, stylish, intellectual, sophisticate. And Richard Nixon's a bumpkin from middle America who has these square values and who is awkward in his own skin, kind of funny looking. And it's not really the way it was. This was a very close and I think, interesting election. Yes, Nixon made major mistakes, pledging to visit all 50 states, even doing the debate with the lesser-known Kennedy. But as my narrative will show, he not only made ground, but he came back to win 3 more debates. Eisenhower comes off the bench, campaigns for Nixon in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh, in Philadelphia, in New York, and Los Angeles, draws enormous crowds. Eisenhower is the father of his country. He's immensely popular. Nixon closes fast. He wins the election. And I don't mean to filibuster, but the point here is if you want to understand Watergate, you need to understand what happened before Watergate.
A lot of people know about the Kennedy, that election with the mafia involved in Chicago, but you also write about LBJ and the Texas vote.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting. It's an article of faith among liberal college professors that even if the Republican argument that Chicago was stolen by a combination of the Daley machine and the mob is correct, it wouldn't have changed the outcome of the general election because Nixon would still be short. But if you add Texas to that, the election was stolen. Well, the truth is, and this I go into great detail here in the book, the vote theft in Texas was far more egregious than it was in Chicago. So, for example, the Texas ballot, kind of backwards to all reason, has all the presidential candidates listed, and includes the Prohibition candidate and the crazy independents, but it's Nixon and Lodge versus Kennedy and Johnson, and then the others. You're supposed to cross out the names of those you are not for, leaving only unmarked the person you are for. If you circle the most logical thing, the people you are for, and you're in a county in which Lyndon Johnson controls the machinery, that ballot is thrown out, invalidated. If you are in the Republican counties or even the neutral counties, you're given the benefit of the doubt that that's what the intent of the voter was when he circled it. Well, Johnson threw out 56,000 Nixon Lodge ballots in Dallas alone. And because there's no Texas recount law, those ballots, they were burned right after the polls closed. So there can be no recount. You wonder why Nixon was paranoid? You'd be paranoid too if he'd come back from these early mistakes to close fast. Nixon lands at the airport in Los Angeles, election eve. He's exhausted, but he thinks he's won and he's right. He has, and they steal it from him. He also, interestingly enough, for those of us who are in politics, he hoards his money for the last 45 days. The Kennedys are pounding him, but he won't give up his war chest. In the last 4 weeks, he's massively outspending Kennedy on television and radio. The only time that he does have financial leverage. That's discipline, because he had to sit all those weeks getting the crap kicked out of the Kennedy television advertising and hold his fire. So he runs a masterful campaign. He's cheated. That's the real narrative.
Kennedy's assassinated. Your last book was about LBJ and his role in Kennedy assassination. But not only does that affect Kennedy's presidency, obviously, but it sets up Nixon for a lot of the troubles writing this book came from the Vietnam War, which Johnson was largely, escalating our presence there. So tell us about LBJ while he was president and what type of president he was.
Yeah, in many ways, this book, Nixon's Secret, is a sequel to my first book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ, because it is the next chapter. You have three very powerful men, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon, who all want the presidency in the same year, 1960. And they all get to be president at different times, which is somewhat amazing. And they're elbowing each other, and they're wiretapping each other, and they're spying on each other. And the whole narrative is down and dirty. And the things that we associate with Nixon, wiretapping, illegal cash, break-ins, black bag jobs, these are Robert Kennedy's tools in trade, not to mention Lyndon Johnson. Johnson breaks into Kennedy's doctor's offices in Manhattan to find evidence that he's being treated for Addison's disease. It gets blamed on Nixon, but Nixon's psychiatrist's office is burglarized to get his medical records. Nixon's hotel suite is bugged by the Democrats the night before the second Nixon-Kennedy debate at the Sheraton Ward Park Hotel in Washington, D.C. So, I try in this book to put Nixon in some perspective of the way the game was played. It was all elbows and knuckles. This is not beanbag to become president. And Ambassador Joseph Kennedy, he was a bootlegger, he was a gangster, he made massive pay, paid for the tip. $200,000 tip to a tipster was a disgruntled accountant who said that Nixon's financial records could be stolen by breaking into this one particular accounting firm. I produced the name of the private detective who did the break-in. So, I'm just trying to give a realistic sense to people of how politics was in the 60s, 70s.
Nixon gets elected president in '68. You came on as in the White House. You were very young. Tell us about that, how you got involved with his re-election.
I really made my connections with Richard Nixon in the 1968 campaign in the sense that I became the chairman of Youth for Nixon in the state of Connecticut. I was appointed by Governor John Davis Lodge, who was the chairman of the Nixon campaign, to become my political mentor. Now, John Lodge was a dashing, handsome brother of Henry Cabot Lodge, the senator from Massachusetts, and Nixon's 1960 running mate. John Lodge was a bit more conservative than his brother. He had multiple careers. He was a congressman, he was governor of Connecticut, he was ambassador to Spain and Italy, but he'd also in the 1930s been a fairly big movie star in both Hollywood and much bigger in Europe. He also was one of the most legendary swordsmen of all time. This guy, as they say, got more ass than the toilets. He was just a smooth, he was very handsome and very smooth with the ladies. Anyway, he had an aversion to flying. He was flying. So my first job in politics was driving this guy all over New England. He spoke Italian, Spanish, French, and he was in the war, and Portuguese, and he was in the wars making deals with these Republican power brokers. In Connecticut, the Democratic Party was the party of the Irish. That meant that the Republican Party had to be the party of the Italians, because the Italians weren't really welcome in the Democratic Party. So you had this kind of all-Catholic intramural. And I watched this old man put together the delegates to get Richard Nixon renominated. He then, when I went to college at George Washington University, he wrote a letter of recommendation for me. I got picked up for a White House internship, which isn't nearly as glamorous as it sounds, in the sense that all I did was sit in this little cubicle and cut up newspapers and paste them down to a paper, and then copy them, or get them copied for Nixon's news summary. An operation that was run by Patrick Buchanan, who I think I met once the entire time I worked there. So I used my relationship at the White House in 1970. In 1971, I started brown-nosing Jeb Stuart Magruder, who was kind of a designated executive director of the committee to re-elect the president, the guy whose job it was to set up, and then theoretically, when Attorney General John Mitchell left the Justice Department to chair the president's re-election, probably a bad idea in retrospect, Magruder would drop down to be the number 2 man. Magruder was a weasel, I mean, a real piece of work, and I really kind of tell some stories on him in the book, but in my case, I was 19. I later learned that the budget for the position they ultimately gave him in the campaign was budgeted for $36,000. I was working for 22 or whatever it was. And he loved the fact that he excluded me financially and I could do the job. So that's how I really got in.
You make the case that Nixon, with his starting to move towards ending the war in Vietnam, negotiate with the Soviets with the SALT Treaty, kind of rubbed some of the military establishment.
Yeah, I really think that the Central Intelligence Agency, the Joint Chiefs of Staff particularly, Army Intelligence, the Pentagon, they think Nixon's going to be the ultimate hardliner. I mean, Nixon has criticized the war and everything Johnson's done in the war, and every time Johnson escalates, Nixon says, not enough, not fast enough, not heavy enough, not enough tonnage. So he's viewed as being a super hardliner on the war. Now, through the 1968 comeback, he really pretty masterfully fudges where he is on the war. The allegation that he told the voters he had a secret plan was really not true. He implied it, but he never actually says, I have a secret plan, but he would, interestingly enough, when he talked about it, he would pat his breast pocket like the plan was right in there, right? It was really masterful. I really can't tell you what I have in mind for the Vietnam, but I have some thoughts. It was very clever. Anyway, the peace voters think he's a peace candidate. Oh, he's got all this international experience. He'll end the war. So he's saying we have to end the war and win the peace. So he's trying to have it both ways, which he very skillfully does. Now, when he gets in and he assesses the situation, first thing he looks at all the facts about the war to try to reach a conclusion. The conclusion he reaches is that this isn't going to work and we can't win. So he escalates the bombing, but essentially it's a cover to get all of our troops out. And he brings everybody home by the time he runs for re-election. I think, and he does it over the objection of the Pentagon, over the objections of Kissinger, particularly over the objections of the Defense Secretary Melvin Laird. They also not happy about this whole détente thing. I mean, they want to bomb the Chinese. You want to trade with them. Nixon's talking about deep weapons reductions. What are we going to tell the defense industry boys? I mean, Nixon is not what they expect at all. He's pro-détente. He is for a new era of negotiation. And he cuts our losses in Vietnam because we are chewing up American men, and he realizes that the Johnson-Kennedy war formula won't work. So he is basically declaring victory, as Senator George Aiken said, covering our withdrawal with bombing to kind of knock them back. The second part of this plan for the survival of South Vietnam was continued support. Once the Democratic Congress under Ford rips that support out from under South Vietnam, it falls to the communists. But that is not Richard Nixon's fault, because the second part of his plan was never executed. The support after our withdrawal.
Because of his views on the war, and they weren't happy with all that, you write that there were actually 2 planned assassinations, and we're here in South Florida, and you said one at Key Biscayne and one at the 72 convention in Miami Beach. Tell us about who's behind that.
Yeah, I really think that the CIA industrial complex, the CIA, the Defense Department, the Joint Chiefs particularly, they start spying on Nixon as early as 1969. There's an operation going on in the White House in which a military attaché is going through desks, files, briefcases, burn bags, photocopying top secret information about the status of our negotiations in Vietnam, and matters pertaining to do with all of our international relations. They are being photocopied and replaced by night. They're going to Admiral Welander. Admiral Welander is who's in charge of the military attaché office. He is sending them to Admiral Thomas Moore, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. This is treasonous. They're spying on the chief executive, and they're not happy about what they're seeing. Nixon says to Kissinger in 1969, I think I'll go to China. Kissinger's response, you're crazy. So if you ever want to talk about whose idea it was to open the door to China, it wasn't Henry Kissinger's idea, it was Nixon's idea. One of the reasons why Nixon doesn't destroy the Watergate tapes is because they're his protection against Henry Kissinger, who he knows is a weasel. And he knows that after his death, Kissinger saying, well, I was the god and just put Nixon who was the implementer. No, it's the other way around. So they're his ultimate protection against Kissinger, and of course they end up ensuring that he falls as president.